Welcome to episode 181 of the Women of the Military podcast. This week my guest is Theresa Carpenter. Theresa is currently serving in the Navy as a public affairs officer. She started her career in the Navy because she was looking for a career. All her friends had headed off to school, and she was struggling to make ends meet and knew that she couldn't go to school, and she was looking for a way forward. The Navy gave her that opportunity, and she began her career working with airplanes as a mechanic. She continued to serve, and she was able to get accepted into a program so she could become an officer. And it was there she dove into her love of writing and communication, and she was able to become a public affairs officer after being a surface warfare officer. Today, she serves as a public affairs officer and is currently in Germany. Last month, I was a guest on her podcast, Stories of Service, and I'll link to it in the show notes so that you can find it if you want to see the interview of her interviewing me. And I'm really excited to get this episode out, so let's get started after a brief word from our sponsor. Women of the Military podcast would like to thank Sabio Coding Bootcamp for sponsoring this week's episode. Sabio Coding Bootcamp is a top-ranked coding bootcamp that is 100% dedicated to helping smart and highly motivated individuals become exceptional software engineers. Visit their website at www.sabio.la to learn how you may be able to use your GI Bill of benefits to train at Sabio. Your tuition and monthly BAH stipend may be paid during your training period. They are also 100% committed in helping you find your first job in tech. So don't forget to head over to www.sabio.la to learn more. And now let's get started with this week's interview. Welcome to the show, Theresa. I'm so excited to have you here.
Well, I am so excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Let's start with why did you decide to join the military?
All right. So I am originally from Columbus, Ohio, and I moved out of my parents' house my senior year, the summer before going into my 12th grade. And I pretty much started working a series of different jobs from about 15 to all the way through that high school up until I joined the Navy. And I realized any job I was trying to get right out of high school with no education, no training, no specialized skills was only going to get me so far. And I was starting to rack up a lot of debt. I was watching as my other friends whose parents could pay for their school were going off and attending college and starting their life. And I felt very stuck and felt like my life really wasn't going anywhere. And I had a couple friends that I was talking to at the time about where I was. One was a guy that I was seeing. Another was a roommate of mine. The roommate was in the Marine Corps, and the guy that I was seeing was just somebody who I was going to for advice. And they mentioned about joining the military, especially, I think, my roommate. He must have mentioned it to me. And then I started talking to a couple other people about it. And it just seemed like a good way to pay my bills and to travel and to figure out what I was going to do for the rest of my life, because the jobs that I was having, I wasn't happy with. I didn't see any upward mobility, and I couldn't afford to pay to go to college, and I really wanted an education. So I joined the Navy to get those opportunities.
So your debt didn't even come from going to school. It was just trying to survive off of a high school education and the jobs that you got, and you couldn't make ends meet. And you wanted to go to school, but there was no way that it could happen. And so that was one of the reasons, plus all the other things that you mentioned.
Yeah, I wanted to be able to get some kind of an education. I didn't even really know what I wanted to study, though. I saw education as status back then. Going to college was something that everybody around me was doing. And I felt like I was getting left out of that experience, the college experience, going and living in a dorm, going to frat parties and sororities. I mean, I really didn't see it I'm going to figure out what I want to do with my life. It was oh, shoot, my social circle has all moved on and I can't move on with them. And I can't afford to pay my expenses. I was living paycheck to paycheck. And I just felt so lost. And so when the military came along, it was just this opportunity to get some training and some education and learn a trade. They said they would teach me how to fix airplanes. And I thought, wow, okay. I don't know how to do that. That sounds kind of cool. I really didn't know myself very well or understand what my strengths were. So I wasn't really able to guide the recruiter into something that I think would have more capitalized on what it is I do best. Back then, I was very all over the place and just didn't really know how to tap into those skills that I think I do have now. So I was very easily influenced to do whatever it was that they said would be good for me. And really, they were trying to put a lot of women into male-dominated fields in the Navy at the time. And so they pushed me to be an AE, aviation electrician's mate. And I didn't know if that was going to be good or bad or a good deal, a bad deal. I just did it because that's what the recruiter said you ought to do.
That really resonated with me because I kind of look back at myself and I'm like, why didn't you ask more questions? Why didn't you think about this? Why didn't you think about that? And then I also don't think about, like, I was 17, 18 years old and, like, I didn't know myself very well and I didn't know how to advocate for myself or to, like, even think about what questions should I ask and what ideas or what do I want to do in the future. I just felt really lost. And so when I was going through the recruiting process before I found out about ROTC, they were like, you should do this. And I was like, okie dokie, I'll do that. And I think it was like fuels or something. And and one of the ladies was like, she found me like waiting outside the recruiter's office. And she's like, what job did they tell you to do? And I told her and she's like, no, let's fix this. And she found another job that she thought would be better for me. But it was funny how I was like, oh, okay, I'll do that. That sounds great. And I didn't even ask, like, what will I be doing? Is this something I want to do? And so I think that's why I think so many people end up in jobs that don't like fit their personality or really are like the right place, because the recruiters are just trying to like fill the holes on their list. And sometimes we are so young and we don't even know to like advocate for ourselves or what we want to do. And so when someone tells you this, if you're lost, they're like, you should do this. And I'm like, oh, I am found now and I don't have to think about it. So did you end up enlisting into the Navy and doing and fixing airplanes?
I did. Yeah. I enlisted as an AE and I went P3s in Keflavik, Iceland. I was there for about a year. And then I had a bit of a nervous breakdown, mental health crisis, and I ended up leaving there a little earlier than planned. And that was when they almost processed me out of the Navy. So I spent a year in Great Lakes, Illinois, fighting a med board to stay in the military. So that was my year-long, almost a year. I think I got there in April and left in January. And then after that, I couldn't fly an aircraft anymore. That was a special qualification I had, which was air crewman. So they had to send me what we call like a maintainer, ground pounder. And so I was no longer air crew, but I was able to go fix S3s, which was another aircraft. So I did that for about 4 years after that first duty station. And that was where I got selected for my officer program. So I'd been in 7.5, 8 years when I got up for what's called Seaman to Admiral. So yeah, I fixed airplanes, two different aircraft, 2 squadrons, total of about maybe collectively about 7 years.
And did you apply for the officer program? And what was that process like?
It was clear cut, I think. They wanted a lot of different information. It was the first time I'd ever really put in any kind of like package together because I never had applied for college or any of that stuff. I think I, filled out job applications up till then. I never, recruiting application, but never anything that intensive. And just going through that process was really illuminating because I started to learn like what it was that they considered important. And I studied it. I studied the board and the requirements and what would make my package competitive and put it in and found out that I got selected. But I was worried because I had this issue from my mental health issue from before. And I wondered if that was going to haunt me. I mean, I even almost didn't put in the package and went to medical, had to get an evaluation just to see if I could put in the package. And that incident followed me around for the majority of my enlisted career. Like anytime I wanted to do something or get a qual, I had to go back, revisit this issue, get evaluated again, be declared okay, and then do it again. But every time I always passed whatever it was that they wanted me to get through to show them that I had recovered from this incident. And so, yeah, I got picked up for Seaman to Admiral and got my commission in 2006.
And did you already have your degree, or was that included in the program?
It was included in the program. So I ended up getting my degree at Worcester State College. It's a small university in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I ended up staying out there because I met my now ex-husband while I was going through some officer schools in Rhode Island. So I go to Rhode Island, I go through all these officer schools, like what they call it, Naval Science Institute. That's what it was called, NSI. And then I went through Boost, which was, I think it stands for like Broaden Opportunities for Officer Selection and Training. And what some of those classes do is they prepare you to go to college. So that was a neat thing too, is that my SAT scores, especially in math, were not very high. I barely got the cut off to just get in. And even though my English was very high. So they put me through a special school that helped me with my calculus and physics. And so I ended up taking those courses up in Rhode Island, and I was there for about almost a year going through that process. Then I go to college, then I get my degree, then I become an officer.
And that's really cool that they have programs like that where you can go from enlisted to officer and then have that support of them paying for your school. Did they give you a stipend, or were you full tuition? How did that work out?
I was full tuition, getting paid as an E5. And then I made E6 right before I started college. So I was still taking ratings exams up until I got selected as an E6. And so I always say I left the fleet as a petty officer second class, but I commissioned as an E6. And yeah, it's an amazing program, and they still have it. It's a little bit different how, the rules for it and who can get in and all those things. But I found it to be a great opportunity. I got my undergrad in communications. So around the time I got my undergrad is when I started realizing what I was good at and what I love doing. And so I ended up changing my major. Well, not changing it, but really putting myself on that path. Because even when I applied for my officer school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was like, well, I like to help people. Maybe I'll be a nurse. And, I've never been into the medical field or a person that wanted to do anything medical related. I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. I thought maybe as a kid I'd be a social worker. I always liked journaling and writing, but I just really didn't have anything that I had worked on long enough to get really good at. And so I went to the muscular dystrophy camp, the summer before I started college. And that's where I met a friend who's still a friend today, who was a journalist in the Navy. And when I met her, it sort of reinvigorated all these things that I had remembered about, things that I was good at and things I enjoyed doing. And so after that, I was like, oh, shoot, I'm going to try to become a public affairs officer. So I knew at that point, even before I started college, that's PAO is what I was going to try to eventually do.
Yeah, I think it's really good to talk about how figuring out what you want to do and what you like is a process. And it's not a bad thing to not know. It's actually a normal thing to not know. I think sometimes we kind of push people to make decisions about their future when they're really young. And my degree is in civil engineering, and I now run a podcast, and I do love math, and that's why I did engineering. But I also really love writing and speaking and the technical stuff for the behind the scenes editing. I find that really fascinating, but I didn't like engineering as a career field because I thought it was kind of boring to sit and do AutoCAD drawings. But they were like, oh, you like math, you should be an engineer. And that was as much as the conversation went, instead of thinking about other things. And for a long time, I felt really inner turmoil of being a woman in a STEM career field and then leaving it to do writing. But this is what I love, and having my degree in engineering does help me with how I'm methodical and that sort of thing. And that doesn't mean I can't ever go back to engineering, but I think there's no one path forward. And I feel sometimes we put people in boxes and not realize that there's lots of opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that it's tough though. I mean, when you don't know how to articulate even to yourself what it is you want to do and how it is you want to spend your time, it's really hard for others to know how to put you into a category if you're not already able to articulate that. And that's why it's so important as a leader to identify in your people who likes doing certain things. You got to pick up on what are people volunteering for? What are the things that they're telling you about that they're working on? What are the things they're not telling you about that they don't want to work on, and you have to pay attention to those cues. And I think sometimes we don't pay attention to what people are driven to do and what drives them. And, I wish like growing up, I had more influences to push me and to nurture some of the things that I really enjoy doing now, because I think I'd be further along in some of these passions than I am now. Like I'm very grateful for what I have and for where I am. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of young people who can relate to that, because sometimes you're just not nurtured along, or you're not in a place where you're constantly getting feedback on your performance in a particular area. So you don't really build that skill up to a certain level, because you don't do it over and over and over again. And so that was sort of what my problem was. I mean, even to this day, I enjoy writing, but I would definitely not say that I'm a really great writer, a super strong writer. I think I'm a good writer, but I think I could be a lot better with more feedback, more training, more time, and more practice.
Yeah, I agree with that. Like, I took all the math and science courses and I didn't take any writing courses. And I'm like, I bet I really would have loved to take a writing course in college. So did you not already have your career field when you said that you were planning to be a PAO? So it sounded like you were going to school, but you didn't know what your career field was going to be?
Right. Because what happens is you can't, once you get selected as an officer in the way that I was selected, you can't just go public affairs. You have to go unrestricted line, and you can choose certain core competencies. Like I could have back then we didn't have subsurface, but I could have chose aviation, surface. I forget what all the other ones were, but there's the very broad general categories. But things like I can't just go be a lawyer or something like that. It's too specialized in public affairs, or I can't just go be a human resources or whatever. So I had to go surface warfare. I did not want to go aviation. There would have been a lot more qualifications and tests that I would have had to go for. I had no desire to be a pilot. I didn't want to be a co-pilot. So those were my choices. A go SWO was pretty much like, okay, you want to be a PAO, you can do what's called a lateral transfer, but you've got to go surface warfare first. And I'm so glad I did, because I really had a great surface warfare experience. I loved my commanding officer, got to go to a destroyer. It was really good experience. So that's what I did. I went to graduate from college, get my commission at the same time, because that's how it works. You get your bachelor's that same day, and then you get your commission. I mean, there's like a ceremony at the school where you are commissioned in the United States Navy as an officer, and then at the same time, you're also graduating. And so I did that, and I went to a ship, the USS Russell, and I worked on public affairs on the side. And so I was their, what we call the cloud duty public affairs officer. And it was, day one, I walk in and tell my commanding officer that I'm intending to lat transfer. Like I'm going SWO. I'm going to be the best SWO you've ever seen, and I'm going to do my best. But my intention is to get selected for public affairs.
Yeah, that's interesting, because in the Air Force, you can go straight into public affairs. And I know in the Army, it's the same, that you have to be like part of the fleet, which is the Navy terminology, but you have to be part of the fleet. And then you get to like specialize down, which I think gives you an interesting perspective, having been part of the bigger military picture and mission. And then so you like know the lingo of the SWO community, and you're not just like an outsider reporting on what's happening. I think it's interesting how the different branches do it, and how the different perspectives shape, I think, how the public affairs offices run for each branch.
I agree. And I think it is good that many PAOs have been something else first. We also get a lot of people from industry who come into public affairs, especially on the reserve side, which I really like. Like we'll get reporters and journalists and other type of communication professionals, people that have worked in agencies. And I think they really offer, a really unique perspective as well. We even have politicians who go into public affairs. So it's very, very interesting, this career field. And it lends itself to so many different areas of a career. I mean, public affairs people can, depending on what their skills are in PA, but they can do so many different things, from like this podcast that we're doing right now to video editing, or being more of like a strategic advisor, being a consultant. There's a lot of PR consulting agencies. So it really is an amazing career field in terms of just broadening your skill sets and storytelling. I mean, I love telling stories, and this is an amazing opportunity to do what it is that I love doing in or out of the military.
For sure. So you said that you had a great commander and a great first assignment, and you told them like from day one, I want to be a public affairs officer. And it sounded like they were like, okay, well, you can start learning about how to do that along with your job. So how long were you in that job before you were able to transfer over to PAO?
Almost 2 years. So about 1.5 years, 2 years I was there. My commanding officer, he was incredible, Admiral Brad Cooper. He's still in the Navy today. And he arranged for me to go to PAC Fleet, which is a higher headquarters command in Hawaii. And he arranged for me to go there and work in their public affairs office. So that was really key. And then even while I was going to like one of my Navy schools called SWAS, where you kind of learn, it's your SWO school where you learn how to drive the ship and everything, he let me go no cost TAD to CHINFO, Chief of Information. So that was really cool. So I went there for like 2 or 3 weeks and I worked at the news desk. So that was while I was at Russell. I did that and then came back, got my SWO pin. And then once I got my SWO pin, they had a lot of junior officers on the ship. So it was partially because of, timing and manning. They were really sitting well with their junior officers. And so as soon as I got my surface warfare officer pin, he allowed me to go TAD, temporary assigned duty, up to PAC Fleet. And so I got to go work at PAC Fleet before I even put in my package for public affairs. And so that was so that I could work under a Navy captain, and get the experiences of being a PAO without having the designator. And so that really helped set me up for success for when I put my package in. So I had a very good story. And I know not everybody does. I mean, a lot of people's communities discourage them or don't have the manning in their current community to let them go. And I didn't get picked up my first time, but we knew I wasn't going to get picked up. And my boss at the time, that commanding officer, said, put this package in. It'll show you're motivated. You will not get selected. They just won't let surface warfare officers go in your year group right now. But I'm pretty sure they will the following year. He had been a detailer. He had been a job placement person. So he knew kind of the way the rules work. And so he encouraged me to put in a package that he knew was not going to go anywhere, which I did. And then I just put in another package the following year. And that's where I got selected on my second package.
Yeah, it's nice that you had someone who could give you like the back end story so that you weren't like so discouraged to like not try again, because he was like, no, put your package in. You're probably not going to get selected and you don't have to worry about it because it's not you. It's like the year group. And like there's so much stuff going on behind the scenes that it's not just the work that you do, but there's also other things that have to happen to make it so that you can transfer.
Yeah. And I mean, like, I really think like a lot of good experiences that I've had and the leaders that I've had, I've just been in the right place at the right time. Now, I've had some really poor work environments as well. And I've had some leaders that I definitely think could have done better, or maybe I wasn't in the right place and with myself when I was working for them as well. But certainly I would not be where I am today without those mentors and those leaders who, saw potential in me. I mean, because I wasn't probably one of the best SWOs. I mean, I was never on the bridge 100% by myself. There was always like a navigator up there with me or somebody else, because I'm not a person that's very, I'm not that great at math and spatial kind of things. And to be a good surface warfare officer, you've got to be able to do time distance calculations like in your head instantly, because you want to ensure that if something's crossing your bow at this speed and at this time, and you're going this way, you're going to have what we call CPA, your closest point of approach at this time. And you've got to really be able to mentally do that geometry very, very quickly. And I've just never been very good on my feet when it comes to those kinds of things. I have to really think about it, and I'm kind of slow. And I just didn't have the confidence for it. And I just didn't have the proclivity to want to do it. And so it took a lot for my commanding officer to do that. I mean, he still made the board just as hard. And I was certainly not like passed through the system or anything. But he knew that it would be very good for me to get a SWO pin. And I did I've stood the watches in Combat Information Center. I even started getting my EAL qual, engineering officer of the watch. But, he definitely put me on a path to success. And he not only did this for me, he did it for everybody in our ward room. And I mean, we all talk about it. All of us from Russell talk about like how it was just so nice to work for someone that didn't just think, oh my gosh, you have to be a surface warfare officer. That is it. He understood that there's something in the military for everyone if they're willing to put themselves out there and talk to the people in those career fields and then show that they're willing to do the work. I mean, I was volunteering to go to the base PAO office. I was like doing all these commemorative events. I was writing a ton of articles about Russell. I was taking all these pictures. I created a calendar. So I was doing a lot of work too on my end to show that I had the skills to be a public affairs officer.
So helpful to have a good leader who cares about what is the best thing for you and doesn't push you on a path that is what they think the best thing is, but they actually listen to you. And then also just as important is that you show that you're dedicated to it and that you want to go above and beyond and get involved. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So when you finally became a PAO, what was your first job and what were you doing?
So I ended up staying at Pac Fleet. So that was the unit I was at, and I got asked to stay. And so I always kind of looked at it like, well, if you get asked to stay, it's a pretty good sign that they like you and that, you've got a good office environment and things are going well. And so I stayed, and then I got kind of bored because it's a higher headquarters. I was only an O2 at the time. Everybody else was a lot more senior than me. And so I got this opportunity to go on an individual augmentee assignment. We call them IAs in the Navy. And it was to the Philippines, southern Philippines. So they had a pretty big anti-terrorism. They had a terrorist group down there called Abu Sayyaf. And they had, I think, ties to Al-Qaeda. And we were down there at a Joint Special Operations Task Force, helping out the armed forces of the Philippines with their missions. So basically, like, we called it by, with, and through, because we weren't doing any of the fighting, but we were advising them, holding classes, and working with them. And so I went down there as a public affairs officer. I was only an O2 at the time, and I started working with embassies. The first time I ever worked with an embassy, State Department, and documented the mission as much as I could. It was really hard. There was not a lot we could say about what we were doing. And there was a lot of controversy about even the U.S. forces being in the Philippines because we had already left. I think it was Cebu, I forget. And I know someone's going to correct me on that, but the U.S. military had left the Philippines many, many years before. And there were a lot of politicians that didn't want us there at the time. And so we had to be a little quiet about what we were doing, but locally they liked it and the reporters wanted to do more. So it was my first taste of this like push pull with public affairs where, you're sent to do a job and you want to do it, but then there's all these other forces around you who sometimes want you to talk and then sometimes don't want you to talk, depending on the political sensitivities. So that was my first exposure to that. I mean, now I'm like living in that world every day and it's just no big deal. But, as a very junior officer, I was like, why can't we talk about our troops training the Philippine forces? But it was considered to be very sensitive, what we were doing and why we were there.
Yeah, that's really interesting and such an interesting experience to have as a young officer and to see all the dynamics going on behind the scenes, because I think sometimes it's really hard to see like what the political nature or what things are driving. I think that was like one of the hardest parts of being in the military for me was like we had to do things and we didn't have all the information of like why something had to be done the way that it was done, but we just had to follow orders. And that's kind of interesting that you could see that dynamic happening as you were trying to meet your mission.
Yeah, it was hard because, I remember the embassy PAO. She was very, very controlling. And that was my first taste of like how controlling it could be, like very benign, innocuous stories. But then something would happen. Like we had this horrible, when I first got there, flooding. And they needed the help of the NSW guys, Navy Special Warfare, or some of the other guys. The embassy really wanted a lot of coverage of that because it was humanitarian assistance and it was helping the local community. And so that was really, really, really pushed. But when it came down to like holding classes with the AFP or some of the day-to-day stuff that we were doing, there wasn't a whole lot of interest in publicizing it. I remember we had a blog. We had one of these like old WordPress blogs, and just getting a story approved on that darn blog, it was just like pulling teeth. I mean, and you got to think too, they got a million other priorities besides what we're doing down in, we were in Zamboanga, and that's like way south, and they're up in Manila. And so, they're dealing with so much other stuff, port visits or other kinds of things that are much more high level than, this little group of 500, special operators down in the southern Philippines. And so it was very interesting. My boss was up in Manila with them doing like day-to-day coordination, which was nice. So he could kind of be the face of everything. And then I was down in the southern Philippines, me and like a couple enlisted content creators. So like people that can take imagery and videos. But it was such a cool mission. It was the first time I'd ever worked with special forces. And I got to go around to all the outstations and get to know the special forces operators and how they see the world. And I would spend like a whole weekend just going there and covering their events. And it was just a great experience altogether. It was sometimes very frustrating, but a good experience.
I could see how it'd be exciting, challenging, frustrating, like all the emotions put together. So is there anything from your career between that time and now that like was a big shift point or something that you really think that we should talk about?
I think that based on your audience, I think that a lot of times in the military, we think that I would say that from that point, it was more, there wasn't anything major in the career field. It was more in the mental health field. I had some issues with mental health that kept coming back because I hadn't really handled a couple things. So in 2014, I got a DUI. I was a lieutenant at the time, almost a lieutenant commander. And then with my first major leadership position, I was a carrier public affairs officer. And I had a night at a reception where I got blacked out drunk. And those two incidences, I think, were really instrumental in changing the course of my approach towards people, towards social situations, the ways in which I interact with people, especially in groups. And I would say that that's where I did the most growth and development, not so much in the career. The career was just moving along just fine, I think, because I had found my niche. But the mental health stuff, I had to really take a deep turn on.
And do you feel like you just got overwhelmed, or was there like a triggering life event that brought the mental health stuff back?
It was the fact that I didn't have really close relationships at certain jobs. And so I didn't feel like I had a good support system. And so I would get to certain positions and I would just be so lonely. And I really didn't have anyone. And I didn't have a husband like I have now, who's just so supportive and wonderful and just really there for me. And so I just felt kind of alone and lost. And a lot of that was, like I say, self-induced. I tend to even now be somewhat of a hermit, and I do prefer my own company sometimes. So I know that some of it's, like I said, there's definitely responsibility on my end on that as well. But yeah, I think that it was a combination of a lot of things that were